Well, hello, I'm Janell Hobson, and I am the professor and department chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Albany. Dido Elizabeth Belle is an interesting person in history. We only know of her because of a painting from the 18th century. It's dated 1779, and it features a darker skinned woman compared to the white subject that's in the painting. She's a woman who is standing alongside this white woman who's called Lady Murray. And I think what's always interesting about that portrait is the way that she doesn't look like she is in a lower status. She looks like she is on equal footing, or at least almost, because she still is portrayed as if she's in the background. But she's not kneeling, she's not serving the way a lot of black subjects are usually depicted in many European paintings. There's also historical documents that have shown different people who've commented on her presence. We've learned that she is the great niece to the first Lord Mansfield, and he was also the Chief Justice in England at the time. He's renowned for his rulings, specifically the 1772 ruling on Somerset case, the kind of legal beginnings to being able to start asserting the rights of enslaved subjects. He's also known for ruling against the insurers on the Zong slave ship. That was an infamous slave ship where the ship captain and the crew actually threw over 133 captives on the ship, believing that they were diseased or dying, and they wanted to collect insurance money. There have been some of his peers during his time who believed that he was able to make such rulings because of the presence of his great niece Dido, who was biracial. She was mixed race. Her mother was an enslaved black woman who was found on one of these slave ships by her father, who was the Lord Chief Justice's nephew, and so Captain Lindsay was his name. And so we know that Dido was the offspring of those two. She was very much a privileged woman, even though she was mixed race. She was very much a part of the household. As we saw in the movie Belle, there were privileges that came with that, but there was also certain isolated moments where she was not allowed to dine with her family, that she had to eat elsewhere, so they were not exactly practicing equality there. So moral arguments against slavery start to come up also during this time period, and where she would have been seen as a curiosity because they're so small in number in terms of the number of people of color living in Europe at the time. She would have been privileged because of where she was growing up on the estate of Kenwood House. So it's very possible she didn't have to interact in terms of being a regular person on the streets of London. So I think that there was a certain kind of relative safety she may have had living in that environment as one of the only few or the only black aristocrat that was living at the time in London. And then at the same time, we're also talking about London as a place where a slave like Phillis Wheatley, can actually get her poems published. Because she did get her poems published in 1772 in London, and so that we're talking about, that's a good, if that happened in 1772, 1773, so yeah, we're talking about like 6 or 7 years earlier than when Dido Belle's portrait is taken. Well, I think what's interesting about her story, now that we know about it, and I actually talked to the filmmaker Asante about this, right? Because I told her that when I went last year, when I had a chance to go visit Kenwood House as well as the Scone Palace where the portrait now hangs, it was interesting because the tour guides really went out of their way to highlight Dido Belle, to give us her history, and that was great. And then Emma Asante is like, just so you know, that did not happen when she went to Scone Palace. As a matter matter of fact, she remembers there was a tour taking place, and the tour guide, when he got into the room where the portrait hang, completely overlooked it, completely ignored it. And this was before she did her film. And so she had in mind, like, yeah, that has to change. And it has changed. She's like, now that the film came out, so now people talk about her. Now that the film has come out, now people are, even lawyers and legal scholars are rethinking the relationship of the Lord Chief Justice with his great niece, and even asking questions about, did that relationship have an impact on the way he was able to make his legal rulings, specifically around the issues of slavery? And if that is true, then if we're going to talk about legacy, then we have to think about Dido Belle having a direct legacy with regards to changing the course of history in terms of these were important rulings against slavery that eventually led to the abolishment of the international slave trade, and then of course eventually led to the abolishment of slavery. So think of that legacy that she leaves behind. I think though, in terms of black women and mixed race women, it's just useful to know that they were there, that they existed in history, that if we ignore them, then we ignore a vital part of history. I mean, her very presence already changes the way we understand histories in Western culture, where we automatically assume that in the past everyone was all white. Right? That if you go back to London in the 18th century, it's an all-white affair and there were no black people, yet Dido Belle's presence says that's not true. And I think that's a major thing, because nowadays, when you think about the kinds of nationalistic movements that you see around the world, where people want to say, only the English for England, right? When people make those kind of arguments where, this country only belongs to white people, they make those assumptions based on, because our history says that this was ours. And when you have stories like Dido Belle, that totally refutes that history, that it was an all-white affair. And I think that's an important legacy. And it's also useful to know that we've also had black aristocrats that, we may all be enamored with, Meghan Markle, making her mark, marrying into the British royal family, but she wouldn't be the first person entering into, royalty or entering into aristocracy. So that's what those histories tell us.